Well, it's an honor to be invited here to speak at the Peaceworks Conference, and especially one that's called Solidarity in Action, because this is a revolutionary time in the Arab world. And I think there's major turning points in history that people look back on and remember, and we're living in one of these times right now. The Arab world has awoken. The popular uprisings that began in Tunisia and Egypt have spread across the region, from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. And what's fundamentally changed, what's been revolutionary, has been the awakening of Arab populations led by the younger generation. For decades, Arabs have lived in the shadow of corrupt regimes, of despots. For decades, we've been maligned in the West as being backward, as being complacent, of being medieval and hierarchical. In 2011, Arabs are proving that we're anything but. Across the Middle East and North Africa, Arabs are inspiring the world with their peaceful yet determined demand for freedom, justice, accountability, and the rule of law. And at the epicenter of it all lies Egypt's revolution. As we gather here today, right now, at this very moment, Tahrir is filled with tens of thousands of people. It's the biggest march today since February 11th when Hosni Mubarak stepped down. People are calling on the ruling military generals that run the country to pay heed to the demands of the revolution. And there are numerous acts of solidarity. People are waving the flags of Yemen, of Bahrain, of Syria, of Libya. And I just got word that a group marched to the Israeli embassy, and they were waving Palestinian flags, and they took down the Israeli flag. Now, all of this was unimaginable before January 25th. Now, I grew up in Egypt. I lived there in Cairo until I was 18 years old. My family still lives there, my childhood friends are there, and I used to travel every year, once a year, to visit them. And the only Egypt I've known is the one that was ruled by Hosni Mubarak. The one where people didn't protest in large numbers. And if they did, they would be quickly outnumbered by 10 to 1 by state and central security forces. They'd be beaten up and arrested and quickly dispersed. It was the Egypt that has been under emergency law since 1981, where talk of politics was largely futile, where corruption and cronyism were an expected part of life, where Islamist groups were seen as the only viable opposition force, where we all lived in Mubarak's long shadow. That all changed on January 25th. Now, I was far away from Egypt when it all started. I was of all places, in Park City, Utah, covering the Sundance Film Festival, of all things, for Democracy Now! Now, I'd heard there was a demonstration planned for the 25th. 25th was named National Police Day by the Egyptian government. So I assumed, like many others, that there would be a relatively okay turnout, but it would be quickly broken up and life would go on. But I was very wrong. There's a popular anger that's been smoldering across different sectors of Egyptian society for many years, especially over the last decade. And that ignited on the 25th. People were inspired by the popular uprising they saw in Tunisia that overthrew President Ben Ali just weeks before. And I was sitting in Park City, I remember in my hotel room, watching TV and seeing unimaginable scenes. Scenes of tearing down Mubarak's face on billboards in public squares. This is something you can't do. And then I saw the police move in. And there was clouds of tear gas billowing in the streets. And they were beating protesters. But for the first time in my life, I saw everyone come together in a mass movement, and they fought back. And they were winning. And this continued the next day. It started on a Tuesday. It continued Wednesday and Thursday. And then Friday was going to be the big day. This was the day of rage, the 28th. And I'll never forget, my cousin Muhammad called me. I was in Park City. We had just finished the Democracy Now! Broadcast. We were having breakfast and my cell phone rang, and it was my cousin Muhammad. And he said, I've never heard him speak this way before. And he said, cousin, tomorrow we're going to overthrow the government. I'll never forget it. He said, I don't care if I die. At least he'll be doing something worthy. Now, he's never spoken this way before. He's not a revolutionary or an activist. He's a successful movie producer. So this is when I realized that something monumental was happening and that I had to go home. So I bought a ticket. Within a few hours, I went back to New York to get my passport and off to Egypt. Now I would miss, because I was in Park City, I missed the Day of Rage, but I watched it on TV, as so many of you did. Now in its fear of what was about to take place, the Egyptian government tried to cut off all communications to disrupt the protests. They shut down the cell phone networks, and in a move unprecedented in history, they shut down the internet completely, cutting Egypt off from the digital world. Now, what happened on the 28th was that hundreds of thousands of Egyptians took to the streets. In Egypt, in Alexandria, in Suez, in Mahalla, in Port Said, everywhere. And I later learned that cutting off communications was about the dumbest thing the Mubarak regime could have done. A lot of people told me they were thinking about going out. They said, oh, I was going to stay home, call my friends on their cell phones, maybe follow it on Twitter or Facebook, but I couldn't. So I went and hit the streets. Now what we saw was so many thousands of young Egyptian men and women facing off against this feared internal repression army of the Egyptian government. They're run by the despised Ministry of the Interior. And they were met with significant violence. They were hit with a lot of tear gas, then rubber bullets, a lot of batons, and then live ammunition. But they just kept on coming. One person told me, when some of us would tire, others would head in. We gave each other courage. And in the face of all this violence, and you can see this on videos that are up on YouTube, people are chanting, Silmeya, Silmeya, which means peaceful. And they won. They overwhelmed the police and state security forces. This is no small force. There's about 500,000 of them in Egypt. It's a giant lawless militia. But they were overwhelmed and they were forced into a full retreat. And you can see it on the streets of Cairo, them physically backing up. And then the Egyptian army was sent in and the police disappeared. Now this shifted the balance of power in Egypt irrevocably. We had won the streets. And in Cairo, we won Tahrir. And people marched in triumphantly. Now I landed in Cairo the next day. So I went straight from the airport to Tahrir. And when I got there, the first thing that I saw was the headquarters of the National Democratic Party, Hosni Mubarak's party, smoking, a burnt out blackened shell, unbelievable. I went into Tahrir, thousands of people there chanting, Irham, which means leave. I saw people advancing on the Interior Ministry building where the despised Interior Minister, Habib al-Adli, was still holed up with remnants of his security forces. They were sniping people. People were being carried out bleeding, but they kept on coming. I've never seen that many Egyptians gathered in one place, in a public place, other than a soccer match, because it's illegal under emergency law in Egypt. And it was astonishing. People were fearless, they were determined. And I remember I wrote down in my notepad, I said, this is not Hosni Mubarak's Egypt anymore, and regardless of what happens, it never will be again. I stayed there as long as I could. And as night fell, people cheered and they chanted. They rode atop army tanks. And they protested against this regime that had suppressed them for so long. And the resounding chant was, "Shab yurid isqat al-nizam," which means the people demand the ouster of the regime. And what they wanted was a change of this political order, an order that had kept them hungry, that had suppressed them, that had beat them and tortured them, and that had completely silenced their voices. And this is the first time in 30 years they were making their voices heard. Now, Tahrir was amazing. Many of you were watching it on TV. What happened inside Tahrir was the best of what Egypt could possibly be. It was transformed into a revolutionary republic. And inside Tahrir, there was freedom. I went there every day, and there were all kinds of Egyptians. Young, old, rich, poor, Muslim, Christian, religious, secular. And they made it, they occupied it, they owned it, and they made it into a vision of what this country could be. I don't know how many of you have been to Cairo, but it's not a clean place. The streets. Tahrir was clean. People would sweep it every day. They'd even recycle. I don't know if you've ever stood in a line in Egypt, but it's not a line, it's more of just a fight. But people would actually queue up to get into Tahrir, something really quite incredible. They routed power from the streetlights to charge their cell phones. People brought in food and water and blankets. People were respectful to one another. And as the days went by, when I first got there, people were doing these kind of militant chants and very, not simple, but very direct. But as the days went by and people were free to express themselves, there was a blossoming of political expression happening. So what began as marches and chants turned into poetry, street art, political theater. And what was amazing was that no matter what time of day it was, and I spent a few nights there, people, the energy and vigor that people had, they would chant and rally, and not for any camera or journalist, but for themselves and for each other. They built tents and sleeping areas, and they were organized. And what was most amazing about it was that it was completely leaderless. There was no defined leader or organizing group. This was an organic movement that was extremely organized, and that was the beauty of Tahrir. After being lost for so many years in Mubarak's repressive state, Egyptians had found themselves again. But of course, Mubarak was not going to leave without a fight. And the regime did everything they could think of in the uprising. So first on the day of rage, they sent in the Interior Ministry's forces, like I said, about 300,000 to 500,000. It didn't work and they lost. So the next tactic was that they removed the police force entirely from Cairo and all of Egypt. They weren't even in the police stations. And then they emptied 2 jails. What they were trying to do is create a situation of chaos and try and have people so afraid of disorder as to welcome Mubarak back. That didn't work. There were these neighborhood checkpoints that sprung up all over Cairo and around Egypt. By the first day, the day I arrived on Saturday, when I was walking home, I saw them. And they're already coordinated with shift changes and patrols, and they're calling each other. And I walked by my father's building, and I saw my 16-year-old brother, Tariq, standing with a double-barreled shotgun slung around his shoulder, and his cell phone here like a walkie-talkie, guarding his house. And this is, a kid 2 weeks before really only cared about video games. So his generation is a revolutionary one. Then the regime tried violence, more violence. So on Tuesday, after the first Tuesday after the 25th, was the first million-man march. And it was an incredible turnout, incredible vigor and excitement. And that's the day they called the day of departure. It didn't happen, of course, but what the Mubarak regime did the next day was to launch a coordinated campaign of violence to try and take Tahrir back. And he sent in what's called Baltagaya. Baltagi just means a thug. And Mubarak's used these people many times over the years during elections and during other protests. And they tried to send them in to intimidate and beat the protesters out of Tahrir. I remember when they came in, I was with my uncle, and my uncle told me, they're going to come, they're going to beat us, we're not going to fight back, but we're not leaving. And that's what happened. They linked arms, and the Baltagaya came in, and they're very intimidating people. They're big, they wear these leather jackets, they're cursing, and they beat you. They're holding these big photos of Mubarak. Now I had to leave to go do Democracy Now! From a studio about a couple 100 yards away. I left, and on the show, I interviewed a professor from UC Davis called Noha Radwan, who's an Egyptian American. Actually, I think she's just Egyptian. When we left after the show to go back, walk together back into Tahrir, I had to get something, so she went on ahead of me. When she tried to get in, they asked her, the Baltagaya were basically rioting in front of every gate. And she tried to get in, asked her, are you for or against Mubarak? And she said, I'm against. And they beat her within an inch of her life. And she was only saved by an army soldier who was nearby. I didn't know this until the next day. I tried to get in. And I remember I grabbed my camera guy's hands and we just kind of bent down and tried to rush into it. But we were about to get beaten as well, so we had to back off. What happened inside Tahrir was medieval. It was rocks, it was horses and whips and camels. And we saw that on TV. What was less broadcast was what happened at night. That's when they used live gunfire and snipers. It's unclear how many people died that day, but thousands were wounded. But the people of Tahrir held the square. And so what the regime did next was to try and launch a vicious propaganda campaign. They were accusing the protesters of being like paid by some bizarre combination of Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah, the US, and Iran. One prominent TV anchor actually said that the protesters were in Tahrir because they were getting paid 50 euros and getting a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. I'm not kidding. And so there was this running joke whenever you're in Tahrir, they would hold up pieces of bread and say, Kentucky, Kentucky, Kentucky. But the regime also tried to arrest, and they did, a lot of human rights activists, a lot of human rights lawyers, and they waged a campaign on journalists. A lot of journalists were beaten. Western journalists in a hotel were, they had their rooms broken into, they were interrogated in their rooms. 2 journalists were killed. And we had to hide our cameras when we walked outside of Tahrir. But nothing worked. Every time they tried any of these assaults, the pro-democracy movement only grew stronger. Their demands were more concrete, their will was strengthened. So then 18 days after the uprising began, Mubarak had no other choice. And after 30 years in power, he stepped down. Now it's difficult to describe the elation and the celebration that happened that day. We'd achieved something that only 3 weeks earlier we thought an impossibility. And I think it reverberated not only across the Middle East and North Africa, but around the world. Now, Egyptians were successful in toppling this ruling regime, but the revolution is far from finished, and the road is long. I just want to go through some of the obstacles that lay ahead. Now, 2 weeks ago, tens of millions of Egyptians voted in a constitutional referendum that would amend the constitution. The amendments were submitted by a legal panel that was appointed by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which took power on February 11th. The turnout was very high, it was 41%, which makes it the most participative poll in Egypt in decades, which is very encouraging. But many within the pro-democracy movement voted against them. and they fear that this was rammed through, there was not enough time for public debate, that it essentially patches up a discredited constitution, which will elect a new parliament and president. Now, those who stand to gain the most from these amendments are the Muslim Brotherhood and the former remnants of the National Democratic Party. They heavily campaigned for them to pass, and they passed. So the changes, they set up these elections, and the new parliament will draft a new constitution. Now, we're holding elections so rapidly, the parliamentary elections are scheduled to be held in September. It begs the question, will they really be free? Given that new political parties have less than 5 months to form, organize, campaign, and get known around the country. And in Egypt's a country of 82 million. So that leaves just two forces, really entrenched power interests like the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood that are ready, will be ready in September. Now that's not very revolutionary. But people in Egypt are riding the swell of a newfound political agency. And I still have hope that they're going to really fight for a democratic process. Now, regardless of the outcome of this election, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces would very much, I believe, prefer to hand control back to a civilian government of the day-to-day affairs of Egypt and return to the backbone of power, as it has been for so many years. The Egyptian army receives $1.3 billion a year in US military aid. It will resist any shift in foreign policy that could threaten its relationship with Washington. The day after the Supreme Council took power, they affirmed Egypt is committed to all regional and international obligations and treaties. Now, this presumably includes abiding by the Camp David Accords, facilitating the passage of US warships through the Suez Canal, maintaining the siege on Gaza, and continuing to sell subsidized natural gas to Israel, none of which are reflective of popular opinion in Egypt. The Supreme Council also repeatedly warned against the wave of strikes that gripped Egypt in the last days of the uprising that really dealt a decisive blow that toppled the regime. Now, it was the labor movement that laid the groundwork for the January 25th revolt. Years of strikes and sit-ins and protests. The cabinet of ministers that was appointed by the Supreme Council recently passed a law criminalizing strikes and criminalizing demonstrations under penalty of imprisonment or £500,000 Egyptian fine. Nevertheless, workers are continuing in defiance to strike. They're calling for improvement in working conditions, they're calling for a minimum wage, they're calling for independent trade unions, and the removal of what's called in Egypt mini Mubaraks, which are these corrupt management and heads of institutions that are found throughout workplace and society in Egypt. Now, the military's calls for an end to the strikes have been echoed in other sectors of Egyptian society, namely the middle and upper classes. But activists are already looking to the next phase of this revolution, which is economic and social liberation. Now, within the 18-day popular uprising, I saw gender relations in Egypt take a giant leap forward. In the streets, women risked their lives alongside men to take on the police state, to take on the interior ministry, and also in the defense of Tahrir against the Baltagaya. Inside the square, women, veiled and unveiled, spoke of a new social dynamic where they felt free of sexual discrimination, free of harassment, which was a real problem in Egypt, and free from the constraints of patriarchy. But the struggle remains now to carry those ideals that were formed in this ideal revolutionary republic that was Tahrir to the whole of Egyptian society. Also during the uprising, religious tensions between Muslims and Christians ebbed dramatically. There was repeated chants of Muslim, Christian, we are all Egyptian. And there's numerous acts of solidarity between Muslims and Christians. And since then, evidence has been uncovered from state security archives, which prove that violent sectarian unrest was fomented by the regime. It was a divide and conquer tactic to reinforce the idea that without Mubarak, Islamists would overrule the country. There's also new documents that prove that the Interior Ministry helped orchestrate the Alexandria church bombing on New Year's Eve, the worst violence against Coptic Christians in more than a decade in Egypt. And there was a latest round of sectarian violence, clashes, burning of a church in Halwan, and clashes between Muslims and Christians that left 13 people dead. Many believe these are the work of the counter-revolutionary forces who are trying to take advantage of this security vacuum and try and foment chaos. But what's most concerning right now is the military. The military's response to protesters now in Tahrir and elsewhere is growing increasingly harsh. The army's used brute force, including beatings and electric batons, to break up demonstrations. Hundreds of people have been arrested since the Supreme Council took power. Dozens of civilians have been tried in military courts and have been sentenced to years-long prison sentences. So in the absence of state and central security forces, the military is beginning to fill the void. Now, of course, all of this is happening without any word of condemnation from the Obama administration, which has backed the US has backed the Mubarak regime for so long. During the uprising, they saw that what was happening, it was irreversible. And so they paid lip service to the revolution. And as the US so frequently and drearily does, that they support democracy in the Middle East. So instead of condemning what the military generals are doing right now, he's sent Defense Secretary Robert Gates and the commander of US Central Command, James Mattis, on successive delegations to meet with Field Marshal Hussein Tantawi and shoring up relations with the Egyptian army. And this is the same Egyptian army, of course, the ruling army that's the US has funded for so many decades. Now, in the wider region, the US response to the uprisings is at complete polar opposites depending on who you're talking about. So right now we're seeing the US and allied forces waging a widespread bombing campaign in Libya to enforce a no-fly zone. Now let's remember, this was called for by Libya's Transitional National Council. It's easy to forget that what is now an armed rebellion was once a popular uprising, like Egypt. It quickly found itself in a military conflict with a much better trained and better equipped opponent, and they called for a no-fly zone to buy some time. But what is the end game here? Is the end game to prevent civilian casualties? How can you do that from bombardment from the sky? Just this week, NATO bombed two rebel groups by mistake in two separate instances, killing 20 people. Is the aim to topple Gaddafi with an international force? By some estimates, the trained rebel army numbers only 1,000. Is the aim to create a ceasefire that results in a partition of Libya? The precedent of using no-fly zones is not good. In Iraq in the 1990s, it represented the longest sustained US bombing campaign since the Vietnam War. And while there's heavy debate about the no-fly zone, I for one do not agree with it. It should not replace conversations about solidarity with the Libyan people. Their struggle for freedom deserves our strongest support. Now, of course, the selective use of intervention by Western powers lays bare their hypocrisy. During Israel's brutal and murderous assault at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, the Palestinian population was completely vulnerable to a massacre from the air, land, and sea, and there was no talk of a no-fly zone. Just in the past 2 days, we're seeing a new assault. Israeli strikes shelling with helicopters, with tanks. Not a word from the US or international community. And the Arab League, which supported a no-fly zone in Libya, is also silent. So Palestinians, it seems, don't deserve support or not even recognition. And meanwhile, In other Arab countries, the US is indirectly intervening not to support the uprisings, but to suppress them. In Iraq, at the end of February, this is a very underreported story, tens of thousands of Iraqis took to the streets, the largest protest in Iraq in years, and they called for food, for economic security, for electricity. And they were peaceful protests, and they were fired on with rubber bullets, with water cannons, sound bombs, and live bullets. They killed up to 30 people. The next day, US-backed Iraqi security forces arrested 300 people, including prominent journalists, artists, and lawyers. Of course, there was no word from the US government about this. And one can only think that one of the biggest crimes of the 2003 invasion of Iraq was that it robbed Iraqis of a popular uprising like we had in Egypt to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And in Bahrain, which is a key ally of the US in the Gulf, it hosts the Fifth Fleet. US-backed Saudi forces were deployed to crack down on protesters. They killed activists, they arrested activists, they arrested people in hospital. Now, Obama, his response was to urge both Saudi Arabia and Bahrain to maximum restraint. Whenever you hear the US urging restraint, that means that one of its dictatorial allies is up to no good, and they're not really going to take any action. And the same goes for Yemen. In the face of growing popular protests in Yemen, which started out very peaceful and they remain to be so, largely very peaceful protests, the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh in late March deployed snipers. In one day, killed 52 people and injured 200. In response, the State Department, incredibly, urged all sides to practice restraint. Now, the Obama administration has incredibly escalated a covert war inside of Yemen. It's dramatically increased funding to Yemen's military, particularly its elite counterterrorism unit. What's important to recognize as we watch Yemeni security forces gun down their own civilians in the streets of Sana'a and other cities of Yemen is that if Saleh decides to unleash these US-trained forces on his own population, then there'll be significant bloodshed. Now, I don't want to sound like too much of a downer, but I think it's important to understand the obstacles, both internal and external, that lay ahead for these unfinished revolutions in the Arab world. But regardless of what happens in the coming weeks and months and years, we have witnessed the birth of something new in the region. The day Hosni Mubarak stepped down, the victory chant in Tahrir was Irfa rasak fouq inta Masri, which means lift your head up high, you're Egyptian. Arabs have found their dignity again. And that's something that won't go away anytime soon, and it's something that cannot be crushed by force. Arabs have taught the world a lesson in what democracy looks like. And they call their revolutions beautiful, because they are. I think the significant forces seeking to block real reform in the Arab world can be overcome, and the future is bright. Let me just end with the words of Columbia University professor Rashid Khalidi. He recently wrote this, quote, "We're all privileged to be experiencing a world historical moment, when fixed verities vanish and new potentials and forces emerge. Perhaps one day, some of us can say, as Wordsworth said of the French Revolution, 'Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven.'" Now, I know things seem difficult right now in Palestine, but it's always darkest before the dawn. And I think one day we will see a free Palestine. Thank you.
I know El Barda has said that if Gaza is attacked, that Egypt would, if he was president, Egypt would respond by attacking Israel. I also saw a headline somewhere that said all the presidential candidates had agreed to this. Now, I don't know who the candidates are, but what has happened to al-Baradei after he said that? I mean, is it popular? Is it going to go somewhere? Or?
Well, a comment like that would be very popular in Egypt. Whether it's true or not is a different story. And like I said, I think that's where, things like that is where the real challenge lies, because something like that would be resisted by these ruling military generals. And because that threatens their relationship with Washington, it directly threatens the funds they receive. And so big shifts in foreign policy like that, I think, are going to be another phase in the struggle to liberate Egypt. The army right now, under the Camp David Accords, they can't even enter Sinai. This is a source of humiliation for them as well. So there's conflicting interests. One of the candidates who's seen as a leading candidate in Egypt is Amr Moussa, who was the foreign minister for Mubarak for 10 years, from 1991 to 2001. He became the Secretary General of the Arab League, and he recently resigned to run for president. He became very popular in Egypt for talking tough on Israel, but not really taking tough action. I don't think he said that about attacking Israel. I think a truly representative government in Egypt would heavily change the Egypt-Israeli equation, and I hope to see that happen. But I don't know what will happen going forward.
So I want to first say thank you very much for your great work in reporting in general and from Egypt and with Democracy Now!
Thank you.
It's been so wonderful to have those voices heard here. And of course, we couldn't do without Democracy Now! These days. But I wanted to ask if you could reflect on your hopes or your thoughts on the potential for further Coptic Muslim solidarity. Just was so heartwarming to hear about that. Do you see it going forward?
Look, I mean, I think what's been very clear from these documents that were uncovered from state security archives is that there was an intentional campaign by the Mubarak regime to foment these divisions. There was, I mean, the fact that they orchestrated this attack on New Year's Eve, bombing of a church that was the worst violence against Copts in a decade, says a lot. There is a radical Islamic movement that's not the Muslim Brotherhood, it's a Salafi movement which is funded by Saudi Arabia that is very anti-Coptic. There's Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution which enshrines Sharia law as the basis for jurisprudence in Egypt. However, again, what we saw in Tahrir, I think, was the ideal. And the ideal was beautiful. When Muslims would pray on Friday, the Copts would guard Tahrir. Then there would be a Christian mass after the Muslim prayer. You would see Christians and Muslims walking arm in arm, holding a Bible, holding a Quran. So these divisions, I believe, were stoked by the regime. And when you repress people like that, they start to eat each other alive. And once that pressure valve is removed, I think going forward we won't have these problems. But I think it's important to realize there are significant counter-revolutionary forces who still are trying to stoke this divide. And there's not real freedom for Copts. I mean, this point about Article 2 in the Constitution is a real problem, and it's actually very hard to change. But I'm hopeful.
Okay, Sharif, thank you so much for your good work. My name is Abdel Bashir from Gaza Strip, and I have two questions for you. First one, how do you expect the new Egypt, especially for Gaza siege? Because you know and I know that what was happening during Mubarak, especially about Gaza. And the second question for you personally as a journalist, why the media, they didn't focus on what's going on in Bahrain, in Kuwait? Because during the Egyptian revolution, there was another revolution in Kuwait, in Bahrain, but the media didn't focus so much about those, like what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and now in Libya. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. On the first question regarding the siege of Gaza, I mean, I think it's clear what Egyptian public opinion is, and that is to lift the siege. We're seeing right now, I just got emailed photos, there's hundreds of people in front of the Israeli embassy right now protesting against the shelling and the siege of Gaza. So if a true civilian representative government can emerge out of this revolution, then I think we'll see a real change. In the immediate future, I think the clampdown as it has been will be lifted somewhat, but a true lifting of the siege, I don't see that happening, unfortunately, anytime soon, because the ruling generals still rule the country. As far as the media coverage, I was in Egypt and I was surprised when I came back that the level of corporate media coverage of the Egyptian revolution was really wall-to-wall coverage. And there was a study by the Pew Center for Journalism that found it was the most covered foreign story since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, I think that the corporate media in this country kind of will always toe the line with the administration, the government. And when the Obama administration started backing the protest movements, then we saw kind of this surge of coverage as well. And we also saw when reporters actually do their job and they're on the streets with people, there's no denying what's happening. So Anderson Cooper was there and got punched in the head by a 12-year-old. And the next day, his coverage changed significantly. It was no longer the regime says this and the protest movement says this. It says no. These are people fighting for democracy, and they're fighting a US-backed dictatorial regime. And he spoke in those terms. When it comes to Bahrain and other countries that are backed by the United States, there's simply less taste in the corporate media to cover that. And that's to their detriment. And I think you see what an effect. I mean, Democracy Now! Is one thing, and we have a lot of widespread support, and a lot of people know the show. But it's nowhere near what CNN and MSNBC and Fox News are. And when those networks cover an issue like they covered Egypt, then it makes a significant difference. And I think this was one of the first times in so many years that Americans across the country saw Arabs, and they didn't see them killing people or screaming some Islamist thing, but they saw Egyptians that they can relate to, and that really changed a lot. And we're seeing all this solidarity now between places like Madison and Egypt. So I'm very hopeful about that, but yeah, reporters just need to do their job a little better. It's a big failure.
Thanks, Sharif, again for your great work. My first question was, could you speak a little bit more about what the Palestine Solidarity movement looks like in Egypt, and in particular, if it was visible in these protests and in Tahrir Square in particular, and then also, I'm sorry if this sounds repetitive, but could you speak a little bit more about, in your estimation, how entrenched the collaboration with Israel is in the Egyptian ruling class, so we can get a better idea of what it might take to actually, fully open the Rafah crossing and some of that.
Well, we saw in Egypt when there was the Free Gaza movement and the Viva Palestina that came through Cairo. You have to realize in Egypt it was very hard to protest. You really have to have a lot of courage because you're risking imprisonment and beating. And the turnout for those protests was very high. It was still small compared to what happened. But I think Palestine is a huge issue in Egypt. It's one of the main issues, and it was a source of humiliation for the Egyptian public that Egypt was complicit along with Israel in the siege of Gaza. Some of the biggest protests before the uprising were in solidarity with Palestine. There was the Iraq War protest, and then the rest were after Operation Cast Lead. So I think there's no denying the support in the Egyptian populace. And as I said today, there's protests, and people, I think, will continue to push the boundaries on this as there's more room to think about it. As far as how entrenched the interests are, they're deep. Israel, I mean, Egypt sells, it's really quite unbelievable, subsidized natural gas at a loss to Israel when we can hardly feed our own population. So this is another source of humiliation, and something that people, if this doesn't change, there'll be another uprising against things like that. The Camp David Accord, the Egyptian military can't enter Sinai. These are treaties that were forced under dictatorship on Egyptian people, and Egyptian people know that. And I think, again, to open the Rafah crossing will take a lot. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, because the Egyptian military, when I say the Egyptian military, I'm talking about the ruling generals and officers. There's a big difference between the soldiers and the ruling military and the generals, because they live with all these privileges. These privileges will be threatened by opening Rafah. So, but they're also listening to Egyptian popular opinion somewhat. I think it's a long fight. It may happen after parliamentary elections in September. I don't think it'll happen before that. And another thing with the military is, I think, the protesters, at least in Tahrir, won over the soldiers on the ground in the tanks and who were protecting the square. You'd see them being carried on the shoulders of protesters and holding flowers, and really quite amazing. So I think there's also a split between the military, which could prove significant going forward.
Yeah, thank you for your great work, and I'm looking forward to its continuation. Your work on democracy now is really making me and many other people realize that 2011 is a world historic year. Anyway, this is my question. Could you talk about the kind of nature and strength of the labor and left movements defined broadly, and also their strategy, short run and long run, and some of the visions of the labor and left movements in Egypt? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So, the labor movement was probably the most important element to this uprising. They really laid the groundwork for this revolution. They've been the most radical protesters in the years leading up to this revolution. There's a group called the April 6th Youth Movement, which was one of the leading organizers for what they called this Facebook revolution. There's a joke in Egypt that goes something like, it involves two of Egypt's former presidents, Anwar al-Sadat, who was assassinated, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who died of a heart attack. So Mubarak dies, and he goes, probably not to heaven, but he sees Abdel Nasser and Sadat in the afterlife, and they ask him, so what did you win? Was it a bullet or was it a heart attack? And he shakes his head, he says, no, it was Facebook. But, people here love to call it the Facebook revolution, but that just helped organize something that was happening already in Egypt, and that was the labor movement. And the April 6th Youth Movement was leading the organizing of this revolution. The reason it's called April 6th was because on April 6, 2008, in the biggest textile factory in the Middle East in Mahalla, which is in Upper Egypt, which is actually south of Cairo, there was a major strike organized. The strike actually never happened because they sent in state security forces to break it up on the 6th, and they arrested hundreds of people. But it was a big impetus, and there was a lot of solidarity amongst Egyptian people to really begin supporting Egyptian workers. And so they called themselves the April 6th Youth Movement. There's been estimates that as many as 2 million people, workers, have taken part in strikes and protests and sit-ins over the years. And since the uprising began, when I was leaving Egypt, I left like 2 weeks after Mubarak stepped down. They joined the uprising on February 9th, and they really dealt a decisive blow that toppled this regime. There were strikes everywhere. When I was leaving Egypt, you'd be driving, you'd go by like some fancy hotel like the Marriott in Egypt, and you'd see the housemaids striking outside. If you drove past like a soccer club, you'd see the workers striking outside. So they're really outside banks, and what they're calling for is the removal of all these heads of these institutions, which are basically put there by the state. And so I think they're at the forefront of these changes. And I think they're really the ones leading the way for true economic justice in Egypt, because those kinds of changes are probably more than what the middle class and the upper class hoped for when they joined this revolution. They don't want this kind of change, but this is what's necessary in Egypt for real economic justice to take place, and laborers are at the forefront of that. And since Gamal Abdel Nasser, you haven't been allowed to form an independent trade union. They've all been under the Egyptian Federation of Trade Unions, which is controlled by the government. And so right now we're seeing all these free unions finally form, which will be instrumental.
I have a question about another split. I assume I listened to you. I listened to the BBC while I sew, and on Minnesota Public Radio, they had it on during the day and during the evening. One of the things they talked about was the Muslim Brotherhood, and that there was a split between the old guard that didn't want Coptics and Sharia law and all that, and then the younger ones who had a more open way of thinking. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Muslim Brotherhood was the largest opposition force in Egypt for years. It's been banned in Egypt since 1954 officially as a political party. And so what they used to do was run candidates as thinly veiled independents in parliamentary elections. They fulfilled a lot of the functions that the state abandoned in many areas of Cairo. So they provided schools, they provided healthcare, and they're very popular. And there is indeed a split between these old hardline conservatives. They formed a party called the Freedom and Justice Party. But some of the younger brothers are thinking of splitting off to form their own party. And in the beginning of the uprising, the Muslim Brotherhood did not join. They were afraid of joining because they thought it would just be shut down again and they would be attacked. I mean, they've really come under a lot of repression over the years. But the young brothers decided to join on the 28th. And they really held the square against Mubarak's thugs on the Wednesday afterwards. So there is emerging a split between kind of the hardline conservatives, the old guys, and the new reformists. And there's also, unfortunately, a Salafi movement which is seeking to fill the gaps. But I think the lie that we were sold for so many years by Mubarak, that he sold to his own people and to the United States, was that he would be the bulwark against the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt. And the uprising showed what a lie this was, because the Brotherhood and Tahrir, which they eventually took full parts in the uprising, they were about 20% of Tahrir. And I think that's the support that they have in the country. Egypt's become much more religious over the last 30 years, but it's still at its essence as a secular country. And I think the Muslim Brotherhood needs a seat at the table. They need to not be repressed. And we've seen what happens when you push Islam against a wall, what it becomes. If you let it blossom and be free, that's what happened in Tahrir. And political Islam will always be a part of Egypt. But I'm hopeful going forward, but many people are afraid of them kind of taking power. But I don't see it happening from what I saw in the uprising.
One of the most inspiring things that I saw was Egyptian workers or protesters with a sign on saying, "We stand with Wisconsin." There are a lot of us who think that democracy's been threatened in the U.S. also, and unions are starting to organize and fight back. But my question is, if unions were the backbone of the Egyptian democracy movement, are you aware of how they might be working with American unions across international boundaries and across oceans?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure of any specific interworker ties. I did see these same signs, and I think that shows you government policies drive us apart, and when people take over, it brings people together. And so we're seeing solidarity amongst Egyptians and Americans now, which would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. I don't know how the Egyptian labor movement's working with the US labor movement. I mean, the labor movement in this country has been so suppressed and marginalized for so long. Union membership, I don't know what it is now, but it's down to something like 5 or 7% of the workforce, which, from its peak in the 50s, And in the 50s, we saw the rise of the middle class and this golden age that the Republicans keep talking about. They keep forgetting that this was the golden age of unions, too. But there's a real attack on unions in this country, and we're seeing it right now with Republicans in Congress and on public employees everywhere. I think they need to be as radical as the Egyptian labor workforce. They need to engage in direct action in civil disobedience, and we've seen that these things work when the numbers come together. And I think hopefully Egypt can export democracy to the US and people can take
Thank you. I'm thinking specifically of the theme of this conference, Solidarity in Action, and we're here primarily to discuss BDS as the one call for solidarity that came out of Palestine. But I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on what form our solidarity with all of the Arab rebellions can take. So from Cairo to Libya, how can we be in solidarity when there isn't one specific call? I mean, do you have any suggestions? I'm sure that most of us are not just pro-Palestine, but pro-Arab democracy and Arab freedom.
Well, when you say we, you mean
We.
us here?
Yes.
Well, I think what's happening right now is an act of solidarity. That's a difficult question. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, what's happening right now in Tahrir is people are waving the flags of every country that's rebelling, right? And they're supporting what they call their brothers and sisters, and for kind of a new Pan-Arabia. Palestine is always at the heart of this, and it's the heart of struggle for freedom in the Arab world. But it's also the hardest place to achieve it, I think. How to gain solidarity? How to engage in solidarity? I mean, I think what's happening here is a perfect example of that. I mean, I think the BDS movement is kind of the pinnacle of that, and I think it is growing. And if it does reach a critical mass, things will get very tough initially, and the regime in Israel will lash out, but it'll eventually collapse because it's untenable. I'm a big supporter of BDS. I think it's the way to go forward and probably the best act of solidarity. And I'm in awe of most of you who spend much of your lives trying to promote it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's my personal answer to it. I think BDS is the way forward.